why isn't there a Palestinian state? Let me see if we can like watch this together. I think I will be... I'm gonna turn off my camera, turn it back on the stream side, and then I will share my screen with you instead, and then we can watch it together. Oh, here it is. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it, so let me know if you can. Hold on, resizing your beautiful face. Okay. As best as I can. All right.
If Israel just allowed the Palestinians to have a state of their own, there would be peace in the Middle East.
You can tell me to stop it whenever.
That's what you hear from UN ambassadors, European diplomats, and most college professors. But what if I told you that Israel has already offered the Palestinians a state of their own, and not just once, but on 5 separate occasions?
All right, pause here. So the first thing that he does, aside from just, that's an incredible, David, okay, I'm going to call him David Blog.
Got him! Got him!
Okay.
David, so, and the Maccabee Task Force is like, I have no idea what that is. And damn, he looks kind of faded right now. Anyway, so David Blog is saying the Israelis offered the Palestinians this, like they offered them a state 5 times. The Israelis did not offer the Palestinians the state like seriously once, but that's kind of beside the point. Like the Israelis in the first example he will go on to give were not, Israel didn't exist at that time. So already he's beginning with cap. Continue.
So yeah, that is a very common talking point that you hear always, is that Palestinians actually never had a state. There was no like historic Palestine formation whatsoever, and that it was under Ottoman mandate and then British mandate, and the British offered Israelis the entire area known as Israel, including the West Bank and Gaza. And Israelis actually did a really nice gesture to the Palestinians by giving them Gaza and the West Bank. That was the first time Palestinians ever had any kind of autonomy or any kind of government formation. Is like a really cynical way to present this ahistorical perspective. You know how the map that everybody uses all the time, showing like how little territory Palestinians had remaining, that shows like the West Bank getting smaller and smaller. Yeah. The counter to that from the Israeli government is always to claim that Palestinians never had any kind of governmental authority until Israel kindly gave them Gaza and the West Bank in like 2005 when they pulled out of Gaza. And that's the first time Palestinians ever even had a government. And that before that it was the Ottoman mandate, and then it was the British mandate. And the British gave Israel proper, like the entire Israel land to the Jewish people.
Yeah, that's like a little bit like saying that, like, I mean, and this is like a very imperfect analogy, but it really is actually, I think it stands up, which is that, like, yeah, it's like saying, oh yeah, slave owners gave the slaves freedom. Like, it's like, no, that's not like the Israeli government, it gave them limited political authority that they conceded at the negotiating table after administering a military government for many, many years. I think a really good documentary for your listeners is also, the English title of it, it's called The Law in These Parts, and it's all about the military courts that the Israelis ran. Like, I mean, the Palestinians had a government. It's just one where they have no rights. They could be put in prison indefinitely for any reason. And, if their water goes out, or if they can't, if they build in the wrong place, then it'll be an Israeli bulldozer that comes and deals with the fucking problem by just getting rid of the whole thing. I mean, you're not talking about, and from the period of 48 to 67, the Jordanian military wasn't exactly a picnic to deal with either for the Palestinians. I mean, it's not like the counter to that map thing is like a pretty, part of what the map also illustrates, I think, is like, I mean, we were talking about earlier, just the complete diminishing of Palestinian movement and control over that limited amount of territory. So it's also like, it's not just about how like Palestinians have actually lost land, because they already lost that land. It's about how like, they're allowed to do even less and less and less with the shit that they got.
The Jewish population after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire was 11%. What are we talking about here? What do you mean? Yeah, no one says that Jewish people were not coexisting peacefully under historic Palestine alongside Muslims and Christians. That is an objective fact. Yes, Israel in its state formation or historic Palestine belongs to the Ottoman Empire. You are correct, Chatter. It was objectively better back then. Okay, let's continue. That's what they need to do. They need to
Yeah,
restore. They need to restore Yugoslavia, and they need to restore historic
Yes.
Palestine under Ottoman mandate.
Absolutely. That'll fix everything.
Yes, and Crimea also belongs to the Ottomans.
Let's we're bringing back all the different inter-ethnic republic ideas. Fuck it.
Yes. Okay. That's the last time I will mention the Balkans. Okay, let's continue. What David Blog has to say.
Don't believe me? Let's review the record. After the breakup of the Ottoman Empire following World War I, Britain took control of most of the Middle East, including the area that constitutes modern Israel. 17 years later, in 1936, the Arabs rebelled against the British and against their Jewish neighbors.
All right, you took a deep breath, so I paused it.
Well, so the map that he says there. So the first thing is that like the Arab revolt, they rebelled against the British and their Jewish neighbors. That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is that like the Arabs revolted against the British, and then the British counterinsurgency, resulted in like the wanton slaughter of many Arabs and Jews who began increasingly, vying for their own political influence. And the rightists were ascendant during this time through their various gangs. Hannah Arendt describes it very well for Western readers. But I mean, the other thing was this map where it's just like, oh, so they have a little sliver there that you can see that's like the Gaza Strip, but it's not under this border because it's like treating Gaza as if it's like a foreign place, as opposed to, it's like a very subtle way of saying like, yeah, Israel doesn't have authority over this thing. So, as if it's like alien territory and not like a situation in a place that Israel in its totality pretty much controls.
Yeah, that's kind of them. It's kind of them to show the West Bank as well, and partition it.
I am sure that like the 30-year-old like design person who used like a magic pen to like draw that dotted line also was really like keeping it fidelity.
Do they also? Am I crazy? Is this Golan Heights
up there at the top with the blue? Yeah, that's the Golan.
Wait. Isn't Golan Heights just beyond even any borders? Like it's just simply Syrian land that Israel has annexed illegally.
And Israel's annexed it. Like I believe, I'm pretty sure now that it's just like it's formally part. I mean, that's part of why, like, unlike Gaza, for example. I mean, like it's kind of funny. You have like 3 different stages of Pokemon here because you have like the Golan Heights, which is just now a part of Israel. And then you have the West Bank, which is kind of a part of Israel and even has 3 different territory designations by itself within the West Bank. And then you have the Gaza Strip, which is just like, fucking is a sort of like okay, like the most extreme kind of policing in a sense, which is to say we're going to choke it off completely, and the only governance that they're going to be allowed to have essentially because of our design will be this like inept Islamist group.
Yeah. All right, let's continue.
The Arabs rebelled against the British and against their Jewish neighbors.
Not good.
The British formed a task force, the Peel Commission, to study the cause of the rebellion.
He looked like Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah.
The commission concluded that the reason for the violence was that 2 peoples, Jews and Arabs, wanted to govern the same land.
I memean, it's like, I think here's a good article. I'll send you a good link about the Peel partition that I liked a lot. That's just your Twitch link.
Me back my Twitch stream.
Your Twitch. Yeah, it's no, wow. And now I'm just sending you the number from the end of this link. All right, there we go.
Okay.
So it was really about like this article it does a nice job. It's an academic thing, but it shows that like, for one thing, like the Arabs had like almost no input in this process. It was really like a Peel Commission was as like, anti-democratic a method of like going about this as like one could have done. And it was really not about like, like when you say like studying the causes of the Arab revolt, it's like, okay, well, this is the study of like, how are we then going to manage it further? And the decision that they chose was to, do what this article calls cantonization, which is basically, clean. I think a more accurate way of describing this is not two states or two peoples, but divide and conquer. Because this is like the twilight of the British Empire, obviously, but like the British colonial interest was trying to figure out how do we, it was about balance and positioning for what would ultimately be like. Well, if there are states to come about, we want to make sure that they're ones that serve our interests. And it was extremely classically British to basically wherever their empire had been to just leave two rival ethnic groups in different polities that fucking hate each other. Like it's what happened in Pakistan and India with the partition. It's just like the story of the British Empire is a series of goodbye presents like that.
Divide and conquer. It's a very successful, and even Hamas's creation is a continuation of that same exact policy, but this time in the hands of the colonial force being the settler colonial force of the Israeli government, right? I mean, Hamas being used as a counterweight and being propped up was done with the express purpose of trying to divide Palestinians and offering more power to the Islamist factions as a counterweight to more secular formations, Marxists and the like, to rid the PLO of its influence and power.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's an interview or an article by the former Jerusalem bureau chief of the Times. It was in Washington Monthly a few years ago, where he interviews like a former Israeli colonel who had been, one of the guys who basically first gave money to people who would form the organization that became Hamas because they want, they wanted to weaken the PLO, and it's like. Yeah, I mean, there's a little podcast called Blowback, whose fourth season on Afghanistan describes a sort of similar process by which that, created a lot of problems for the U.S. government down the line and resulted in another catastrophic attack. It's a crummy podcast anyway.
All right, let's continue with the Peel Commission.
The answer, the Peel Commission concluded, would be to create two independent states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, a two-state solution. The suggested split was heavily in favor of the Arabs. The British offered that 80% of the disputed territory.
Pause this. All right, I want everybody to look at this map. How much of that do you think is the arable land there?
Yeah.
And also, by the way, how many Arabs do you think lived in that territory that has also now just been designated to the Jews? Okay, it's a very, this is where, to me, like the Peel map is like a really kind of like, it's sort of like clearly designed, again, this is like classic Brit stuff, right? Like these are two states that like one of them had way more of a shot, in particular because of the massive amount of aid they got, to actually have like, a viable shot at development. Whereas the other state is incredibly, would be incredibly limited and compromised with its natural resources and like what it would actually be able to accomplish. No, ultimately, I think it's like,
ultimately, it doesn't even matter.
This is 80-20. This is 80-20 fairness. Oh,
yeah.
And also, yeah. But ultimately, he reverses it. He does another thing with like the color screen is all fucked up because he's saying that those are Arab states, and then the blue is also Israel, but then it's also the other Arab countries.
Yeah. So ultimately, none of that matters though, because even the areas where like
sorry, this graphic design is fucking me up.
Yeah, even the areas where like agricultural production could happen potentially in the West Bank were immediately seized by the Israeli government in an, of course, unlawful, completely unjustified, completely illegal act later on regardless. So whatever viable areas remained, they took over anyway, even on the supposedly Arab state side. So that's interesting that they brought it up.
The Jews, the remaining 20%. Yet, despite the tiny size,
here it is. This was what was happening. This was the remain.
There's the real like kind of historical comparison here that kind of emerges is what's called like the so-called Free City of Leipzig. That was like a huge sticking point in the lead up to World War II. And, it was this idea of like, all right, trying to wrap your head way, like these kinds of international control or British control things. Like the idea, right, is that when the British mandate ends, this would be given as a trusteeship to, some international body or something. And I think in the case of this, it's sort of like, this is like a great example of like how to bastardize what often, what could actually be a pretty good idea to ensure, meaningful political equality. And of course, like it's sort of poisoned from the beginning when the Peel Commission is using it as like sort of clear cover to essentially like, neuter the possibility of like, a viable development for a future Palestinian state.
Yeah.
Of their proposed state, the Jews voted to accept this offer.
Oh, before I forget, I'm running a 3-minute ad break now, chat. Sorry, but we'll continue. Of course, if you're subscribed, you will see it uninterrupted. Or if you're living in an area where there's no ads. So let's continue.
But the Arabs rejected it and resumed their violent rebellion. Rejection
the Jews
number
voted
one.
it. Arabs rejected it.
10 years
Rejection
later,
number one.
in 1947, the British asked the United Nations to find a new solution to the continuing tensions. Like the Peel Commission, the UN decided that the best way to resolve the conflict was to divide the land. In November 1947, the UN voted to create 2 states. Again, the Jews accepted the offer, and again, the Arabs rejected it.
Yeah, what happened there? Some other stuff happened in that process, I feel like, that he's just kind of skipping a little bit, especially after this the 1947 boundaries.
Well, so I think the first thing with the 1947 is that this is a great example of the difference between an actual explanation for something and then the retroactive justification for something. So it's during this time, of course, that like a lot of governments are experiencing the horrors of the Holocaust and so on, and they're justifying what is, like saying, well, we're all supporting this process because we feel guilty for the Jews who just suffered this thing. And, that was surely a sentiment. But in reality, what I think you can sort of pretty clearly see here is that the way that this map was drawn up and the way that this process, guided into the U.S. and the West unfolded was part of this effort, this, this continuing game at this point organized through the UN to make sure that there wasn't the capacity for an organized, Arab world, to put it bluntly. Palestinian. I mean, I think in the case of Palestinians, one of the other moments, in the history of the Palestinian national movement, also again, this is. I think there's a focusing on this vote is also, I think, in the historical memory of American Jews, and how American Jews won this state and they also got this. It ignores the gradual process by which Palestinians were getting their land stolen, and to which land had been was being, that they were conscious of the potential for massive depopulation, and so. I think that there is this, a kind of you could say, oh, well, the whole UN voted for it and it was a good thing, right? And it's like, well, the whole UN voted to help invade Iraq. They got that one through. So, it's not always a sign that something was necessarily a good decision. And, Arab countries all invaded, not because they had evil in their hearts, but because I think it's, there is a, in the same way that we're now seeing in the present day, there is actually a shared sense of, Arab solidarity that back in those days was becoming much more powerful. The early days of growth, of course, people think of the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. But, obviously, I mean, I'm thinking most of Pan-Arabism. This moment is kind of part of the crucible through which that movement is born.
This must be analyzed through the framework of Arab nations themselves going through their post-colonial nationalist movements in an effort to develop their statehood and independent identity after being subjects of the Ottoman Empire, which was again probably more favorable than the British one, but still not having their unique identity, and then being a part of French and the British empires as well. So, right? Am I wrong about that? Historically speaking, I feel like that plays a role in this as well.
What, the subjection of Arabs under these different empires?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think that's sort of in Israel-Palestine. The thing that gets lost in a lot of this context is that there is a regional and global game that the Americans were sort of beginning to play as part of Cold War strategy. And that meant, picking winners and picking losers. And if somebody gets to be powerful, then that means that there's certain parties around them that have to be weak. And in the case of Palestine, I think that this is part of it's a common thread in Palestinian thought, not as a sort of woe is me thing, but to describe Palestinians as losers. I think it's really to describe the process by which basically in the process of organizing the post-world order, obviously they were in a Gulf state, and so they lost tremendously, and their cause never became even as Arab identity took root and the Palestinian cause remained, the principal, ostensible organizing cause of so much of the Arab and Muslim world. I mean, it was the basis for a lot of the, the Arab oil embargoes in the 1970s. Geopolitical, it was a real and live current then. But ultimately, those countries, leveraged the power of Palestine and the justification of Palestine for their own personal advantages. So yeah, I mean, it's the anti-colonial sort of glue that could have held these countries or this cause together was ultimately, it was never really allowed to be formed because the process of decolonization as it was, or post-colonization as it was really about neo-colonization and about making sure that these systems could assimilate or be absorbed.
But I feel like we're also skipping a step here though, because we haven't even gotten to the Nakba yet. This is 1947.
Yes.
So let's get back to PragerU saying the Jews accepted the offer, the United Nations and the Arabs rejected
Only this
it.
time they did so by launching an all-out war. Rejection number 2. Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria joined the conflict. But they failed. Israel won the war and got on with the business of building a new nation.
They're like,
okay. So the thing that they kind of just sort of skip over there is the fact that they just dispossessed all of Palestine. There were massacres, there were expulsions. The Israeli government lied about it. We still learn about massacres all the time. About the, literally the beach in Tel Aviv. There was once a Palestinian village there that was eradicated in 48.
Mass rapes, mass displacement, murders, imprisonment. All of these things happened with British and Zionist forces. It was already boiling up, and this was basically the straw that broke the camel's back. And again, the Tantura massacre is one that we covered before. One thing to also consider here, PragerU is not getting too far into the nitty gritty that you will hear from other supporters of the Israeli state development. Is always half the time it's a disagreement on whether it happened at all, or if it did happen, it was good. And depending on how right-wing the Israeli person you're talking to, it should happen more often and more frequently, and should happen to Gaza and West Bank as well. And some of the more common talking points you hear even in this community is when they say, well, they delivered pamphlets beforehand, which is kind of like the classic, well, Israel is the most moral army on the planet. That's why they do the door knocking bombs before they drop an entire city block or an apartment.
Israel also has the argument, right, about why does Israel has this insanely robust military legal system, and they also have they have this guy Moshe Halberstal who wrote a moral code of conduct for the army, and then Leon Wieseltier in the New Republic many years ago gave let him orgasm all over the page about how great and unique it made Israel as the most moral army and all that. But why is it that you build those things, one might ask? And it's well, it's because that what you're doing is unconscionable, and that you've got to build all of these edifices on top of it so that you don't ever actually come to grips with what it is that you're doing. So you create a military court system that allows the good liberals or even socialist Zionists, as they see themselves, who participate in it, to remove themselves from the totality of what that they're doing. I think to me that's the kind of that shows the truth of their morality. But and also in the case of 48 and the Nakba, they've the experience of the reason that they that Prager, et cetera, all these people move on from it, is that also within Israel, 48 was not it was a victory, it was an achievement. Of course, they established the nation, but it was not 1967, 19 years later, where which was actual, because after 48, we still
before we
had
get there, wait, hold on, Noah. One more thing I have to mention again. I mentioned the pamphlets. Another talking point also is that these people were voluntarily dispossessed, that they actually chose to leave their homes and, of course, bring their keys with them as well. That is another talking point as well. That is an abject lie, obviously, but it is one that you frequently encounter as well, where technically you're saying that there was ethnic cleansing here, ethnic displacement, but Palestinians voluntarily left their homes. during the Nakba as well, which is disgusting.
It's both what it's describing and presenting as voluntary is obviously coerced, and it's also just a broad lie. I mean, like we know that people were told to leave. We know that Ben Gurion, specifically the prime minister, held up as sort of a liberal founding father of the state, actively encouraged and wanted to make sure that Palestinians would be forced out. They saw this as a land grab. It was there was no. I think that I will say this. I do not think that I think over time they came to understand the gravity of what they had done and how controversial it would be if they'd ever opened up to it at the beginning. But I don't necessarily think that as actors, there was they viewed this was not extraordinary to them. This was what fulfilling the mission meant. This was what they wanted to do. It required a level of dehumanization that sort of became a kind of building block piece, kind of like an animus, a racialized animus that became a cornerstone of the state. It required, for example, and there are millions of Arab Jews. There are so many. Israel is not a majority origin country of people who come from Europe by any means, and so the experience of all of those people in their own home countries when they came to Israel, when geopolitics made it so that these people could no longer live side by side with the neighbors that they'd had for many years and so on. It required, sort of figuring out all right, what is this new ideology? What are we going to get these people to subscribe to and so on? And it involved, I think, in a lot of ways, developing this kind of trying to think of how to put it, this fixation with sort of representing, I guess, a version in Israel that was sanctified and had to do all these things, and you make everybody buy into that myth, even if they don't have a reason to, they don't have any reason or basis for it. There's no reason for a Baghdadi Jew whose family has now showed up in Israel to have to be brought, to be bought into the cause that just a few years earlier had resulted in the theft of land from Palestinians. But there over the course of up into '67, that was part of what the Israeli state building project included.
Yeah, well, not just Baghdad, Jews in Baghdad, but also, of course, Russian and Ukrainian Jews as well.
They were the Pale of Settlement Jews and the German. There were earlier waves of European immigration. Then there was the post-Holocaust and during the Holocaust waves of immigration. Israel is a country that's been shaped by successive waves of immigration in ways that have altered the character of the country multiple times. And it has never been, because Israel, it's a Zionist country, it has never been, these waves of immigration have never really adulterated the fundamental catastrophe, the Nakba, on which the country is based.
There is an Orthodox Jewish person in here who lived in Israel for a while. He said Zionism is the most successful land back movement in history, and then followed it up with genocide is when population triples. Yeah, which is ironic because that is a Nazi talking point. You know what I mean? That's in my opinion, and that is no different than in the camps they had showers because that wasn't for mass murder or whatever. How could you claim these numbers are real? They literally doing that specifically while defending the apartheid state. It is so gross. You can say that my comparison is anti-Semitic all day, every day if you want, but it is literally what you're doing. Disgusting.
Let's keep going with the propaganda.
What do you have for Zionism is the most successful land back movement in history? 2,000 years. 2,000 years. Noah, 2,000 years.
I just think that if you view Jewish history as a 2,000-year struggle to get back a bunch of land in the Middle East, then that sucks, because
it also doesn't make sense.
Forgetting it doesn't, obviously it doesn't make sense. None of that, but that's beside the point. That it doesn't make sense, everyone knows. That's up front. What is nuts about it is the idea that there is actually what it requires is shunting aside a much more interesting and nuanced, and like meaningful history. It's instead about like, making like collapsing the richness of Jewish history into like this teleology that's all about, getting us to Israel. And it's like, all right, great. That's settler colonialism. That's just fucking, like that's wonderful. In 200 years, I'm sure we'll be doing land
also doesn't make
acknowledgements to
sense.
As Corey Robbins said this, it's like in 200 years, we'll be doing land acknowledgements to acknowledge the fact that we did take this land from Palestinians, if we're lucky, if the Israelis are involved.
100%. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, obviously that argument makes no sense for many different points, but like it's also not widely shared by early Zionists either, like, including, as far as I understand, Theodore Herzl, who thought about other lands as well, and not specifically just Israel. Israel being the main one, obviously.
The most famous one is Uganda, where like there had been like one floated. But I mean, it's kind of like I don't really think that they could have pulled off a Zionism in Africa, just because it's like part of the basis for why it was plausible that you could convince Jews to go to Israel was that like, well, get this, we recite all these prayers and we talk about the destruction of the temple and how we have to go back to the land. Like part of like the genius of Herzl was that like he took a very, part of why he's such a popular figure in the Zionist imagination, why Herzl is considered the father of it, not just for, convening like Zionist congresses and stuff, but it was because he was not a religious guy at all. He was called a political Zionist, which meant that in his instance, he really thought about Zionism as a solution to the problem that Jews faced of anti-Semitism in Europe. And the idea, and for that to be a successful idea, you had to figure out like, well, how can I reach these people? How can I, touch them? And it's like, well, there happens to be this place in this land to which we can tell these myths. Like Tel Aviv, for example, the name Tel Aviv in Israel of that city it's a reference to a book by Herzl called Alt Neuland, which means old new land. And the whole idea of somebody like him was to be able to, like the you could argue the genius or the ultimate fantasy that he provided was to say, look, like we can take this thing that, is been disused or whatever, obviously a fundamentally racist assumption, and we can resolve our dilemma by going back to our roots like this. And it was, an adaptation of European nationalisms at the time that are saying similar things about the ties between people and their lands, because nationalism was incredibly in vogue then. I mean, it's a, I think it's to me at least, it's a, the craziness of the 2,000-year story should be something that should be the object of like a really interesting inquiry of like, well, how did the idea become so captivating, rather than just like something that people repeat blandly as like, well, Israel has I just checked, and the Jewish property deed, the pink slip for Israel is 2,000 years. What's Palestine got? Like that's bullshit. That's not real anyway. So let's just not even engage.
It's a part of myth making. I think like it's more so a post hoc rationalization, of course, even though like you also pointed out, Theodor Herzl and early Zionist leaders routinely recognized that this was supposed to be a colonial project. I read something about I think it was Herzl talking to the founders of Rhodesia, saying like this is a united struggle, that it would be similar. It's closer to Manifest Destiny than it is a land back movement, certainly. But it's not like people were hiding that the Palestinians were not going to peacefully be dispossessed of their homes and displaced.
I mean,
they were not oblivious.
There were many people in the early days of the Zionist movement or of the Israeli state, like the most famous of them being a guy named Judah Magnus, who was the first president of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who believed in a binational state. They believed in a singular political entity. American Jews, by and large, until the 6-Day War. Because the 6-Day War in the 60s, like sort of Israel's victory there made it to a lot of Americans just seem like, okay, it's here for real. Like it's not going anywhere. They can hold their own. And there were people like Magnus who, like they thought like this isn't a tenable situation. And they lost. I mean, unequivocally. And in no small measure, that's not just because of the people like Ben Gurion who were in power and in the government and so on, but also because a huge chunk of Israeli society that did not get to hold power meaningfully in government until the 1970s were the reactionaries, the right wingers, the most violent people, the intellectual, and in some cases, literal forefathers of the current right wingers who are, helping to run the show in Israel now. And these are people who I would argue, I think their influence has definitely continued to be understated here.
Can't believe how much we strayed away from the main point of contention here, but Israel won the war and got on with the business of building a new nation. Let's see.
Most of the land set aside by the UN for an Arab state, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, became occupied territory, occupied not by Israel, but by Jordan. 20 years later, in 1967, the Arabs, led this time by Egypt and joined by Syria and Jordan, once again sought to destroy the Jewish state.
I like that they did conveniently ignore the Nakba, of course, but you have to do that, right?
Or like the fact that there was a bunch of negotiations ongoing that Israel was instigating about do these people deserve to come back to their homes? Can we let them do that?
Yeah.
That's it's just we're gonna skip past that.
That, by the way, a refusal of the right to return for Palestinians is, I think, I don't know what your personal experience being Jewish, I don't know what your personal journey was to come into terms with this anti-Zionist opinion, but I think that, as far as I understand, at least some more prominent anti-Zionist scholars and more prominent anti-Zionist speakers will always talk about the refusal of a right to return to Palestinians being a major point of contention, despite having originally despite feeling very excited about building a Jewish nation state, especially after World War II. Recognizing that, having friends and knowing people that are Palestinian who are dispossessed and not allowed, even though their families have lived there for, hundreds of years, whereas some American Jewish person or a Jewish person anywhere around the world could just go and live in any part of Israel that they want, including territories that Israel is currently occupying, is an illuminating moment for many American Jews, or just Jewish people not living in Israel, or even Israeli Jews, I guess.
Yeah, and it's also so that's exactly right. So the right of return for Palestinians is a two-sided issue. The first is that Israelis, or rather Jews around the world, if they can prove to the Israeli state that they are sufficiently Jewish, and there are parameters and there have been court cases, obviously, as you can imagine, kind of delineating who's a Jew and who's not. The one that I would suggest to your audience to Google is the Brother Daniel case, which is kind of, I think, the canonical one. It's about a Jew who converted and it became, I believe, either a pastor, a priest, or a monk. Anyway, and so the Jews have a right of return where they can just go to Israel and hang out. And settle, become, they can move to the settlements if they want, they can do whatever, but
and it's encouraged,
it's the idea
of
of this Jewish homeland is that. So yeah, and they have a whole structure for it. The idea immigrating to Israel in Hebrew means the phrase to immigrate to Israel in Hebrew is la'alot, which means to go up. And what it refers to is, in the days 2,000 years ago, when there was a temple, there was the Temple Mount, in Jerusalem. The Jews would go up to the temple to make sacrifices. And so when somebody leaves Israel and they emigrate from Israel, it means they're called Yordim, which means people who leave or fell down or go down.
Yeah, people immigrating to Israel are returning, right? That's what it's considered.
Well, it's exactly they're returning. It's framed and put into this 2,000-year process. The idea of we are giving a state structure to Jewish peoplehood. Please don't ever think about who it's constituted on. And then the other half of the right of return issue is that Palestinians cannot go home. They cannot go home, and the Palestinians who are in the West Bank. You will have people who've spent their whole lives on a village on a hill in Palestine, and on clear days they can see a Mediterranean Sea that they'll never be able to visit. It is the denial of the right of return requires the complete, these days especially, a sealing of Palestine. or sealing off of Israel from Palestinians. So people who had homes prior to 48, prior to 60, or who maybe even left, border regions in 48 and 67. So people who were in Israel proper and who had stayed there but lived in a more gray area region, let's say, they left their homes in 67 because they didn't know what was going to happen, and now they can't go back. So either it's Jews enjoy the privilege of effectively unlimited access to Israel with the support of the state, while Palestinians they can't even go, they can't even so much look at their shit in person, and the dispossession is ongoing. I mean, people can look up the videos of what happens in Silwan. It's the neighborhood in Jerusalem, or Sheikh Jarrah, more famously, where you'll have some a Jewish guy from Brooklyn being like, "Listen, I'm sorry, your problem, it's not with me. I have just stolen your home, yes, but it's not my problem." And then it's like, and you have a Palestinian family wailing with all their shit in the street because their home of 4 generations is now in the hands of, like Shmuley from Midwood. And it's that's what right of return amounts to.
Yeah,
Like
a lot of far right American Jews are some of the most rabid settlers, all the way from Baruch Goldstein was American too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of the word. But that's it's the zeal of a convert. He wasn't literally a convert, but it's part of what makes these. I would argue it's very wound up with the settler colonial thing, where it's people who come to this place, who do come to this place from, if I were to have made Aliyah, it's like you already are coming in at a place of inflamed and heightened passion. So they're they become overrepresented in both terrorist acts and, as activists in this cause.
Would you say that a similar radicalization occurs amongst formerly ethnically undermined Mizrahi Jews that become really far right, more radical parts of
there's a fact that I was told many years ago that has always stuck with me, which was about a survey done of Israeli high school youth, and it asked them, how many times a day or how often do you think about the Holocaust? And I don't remember the exact responses about how many it was, but what I remember was the relative difference between Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazic Jews, and how Mizrahi Jews thought about, and Sephardic Jews in Israel, so people whose backgrounds are from, Morocco, or even, actually not Sephardic. Sephardic Jews, in Greece, for example, they did suffer the Holocaust, but really, Jews from Yemen, Morocco, Iraq, Iran, how these Jews, they thought about the Holocaust more. And you could argue that it was because there's a phrase that Holocaust scholars in Israel came up with, which was to say that the Holocaust is, in a critical lens, to say that the Holocaust is Israel's civil religion. And so, the feeling of having to compensate for not having, experienced the Holocaust yourself, but being subject to this, induction into, again, a civil religion made for Mizrahi Jews, that is the explanation in part for why Mizrahi Jews, think about it or feel the need to prove, themselves that much more to a myth, which was, it is, perhaps somewhat alien to them, not, because it's, they can't relate to that horror or anything like that, but simply because they didn't come to Israel because they, their parents were, caught between Nazis and death, or they had survived Birkenau or something.
Survivor's guilt.
Yeah, essentially.
Well, I've heard this from even the notion of survivor's guilt being experienced by Holocaust survivors as well. That they survive the Holocaust rather than perish alongside their family members. But I don't know how widely spread that opinion is, or if it's more like a spiritual. This is a terrifying event, like a world-changing event. So it makes sense. It makes sense to have that if you were not not a part of the Holocaust, if you were not rounded up in concentration camps. Someone said envying the dead. Someone said, envying the dead is not uncommon for Holocaust survivors.
There's also, I think, another, I can't believe I'm quoting this guy, but it's a line that stuck with me for many years. I read it in his memoir. But Christopher Hitchens once said that, people on the fringe of an identity cling the most tightly to it. and I think that there's some wisdom in that. In that, like if the Israeli, the new Jew, which is, by the way, the image of a muscular kind of Zionist Jew, in contrast to the pathetic continental European Jewish weakling that emerges out of like working the land and all this shit in Israel. Like that's the culture. Like that's the Israeli, like Gary Cooper or John Wayne, image. And if you are not somebody who like resembles that, in the 1950s, a lot of Mizrahi Jews came up in what were called ma'abarot, which were these, and there were movies made about them, even some comedies about the difficulty of adjusting from living life as an Arab Jew in a sense to moving into these essentially these camps where they were going to be trained on how to live as Israelis, and the culture clash was really quite substantial. And, I think that this is kind of, you could view this, sort of like fierce nationalism as part of what they had to inculcate in people as part of the process to assimilate them into this ideal.
Exactly.
Or to accept this ideal.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect, that's a perfect representation, I think, or a perfect way to try to analyze where some of the more radical elements come from sometimes within Mizrahi Jewish people. Okay, so 1967, Arabs are trying to destroy the Jewish state.
The 1967 conflict, known as the Six-Day War, ended in a stunning victory for Israel. Jerusalem and the West Bank, as well as the area known as the Gaza Strip, fell into Israel's hands.
Oh, they fell into
government
Israel's
split.
hands. They were dropped there by accident. A bird was flying overhead.
You don't understand. They had to do it to him. They had to do it to him. They had to do it to him for the one time.
Over what to do with this new territory.
Yeah, they were split. They were really confused. They
Half
were like,
wanted to return the West Bank to Jordan and Gaza to Egypt in exchange for peace. The other half wanted to give it to the region's Arabs, who had begun referring to themselves as the Palestinians, in the hope that they would ultimately build their own state there.
But go on.
That's 1967 is the first time people...
This is a huge trope. It's still very popular in the right wing. I see it all the time about how like Palestinians had no identity, that like the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, like in Nablus, those Palestinians and Arabs have no connections to one another. In fact, Gazans cared, they're retired more to Egypt. So all that's bullshit. Like that's just like right wing revisionist claptrap. That is, like writers for Tablet magazine or something repeating stuff that they read in books by people who don't speak the language or have any interest in developing an authority, but obviously just want to make shit up about how Arabs could never have developed, sophisticated European style nationalism, including
Jewish people also that lived in historic Palestine. But
absolutely,
but it's really funny
as participating in a culture that was, like included Arabs. They perhaps many of them viewed themselves as Jews who were a minority in historic Palestine in what was obviously, an Arab society.
Yeah. One funny, but also albeit disgusting way to reframe this is also by like, by the supreme eminence of the intellectual and much smarter, much more superior Jewish state, carefully acknowledged the existence of Palestinians for the first time in 1967. Like it's very supremacist. It's very disgusting to just like analyze it from that framework. But he just like drops it in there. It's no different than saying Palestinians have never had self-governance until the Jewish state of Israel gave them self-governance, and look what they've done with that. That's why they live in sewage. The Ben Shapiro line, good stuff.
Neither initiative got very far. A few months later, the Arab League met in Sudan and issued its infamous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Again, a 2-state solution was dismissed by the Arabs, making this rejection number 3.
There wasn't a there's not an there wasn't an offer. No offer. You're just saying it was a preemptive rejection, so you're calling it a rejection, which is like not all right, just keep playing play. That's all there is to say about that. I'm
okay.
It's a rhetorical sleight of hand.
Yeah. So, throughout this history, the 5 times, which is again very common propaganda talking point, like not a single one was like a legitimate, genuine offer. It was always done at gunpoint for the most part, or under the auspices of occupation, in an effort to continue said occupation and only make it worse and worse year over year. Especially like the closer we get to current present time, the more you recognize that reality, especially when like there's a lot of documentation on everything as well.
Yeah.
In 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud
Right
Barak
there.
met at Camp David with Palestinian Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat to conclude a new two-state plan. Barak offered Arafat a Palestinian state in all of Gaza and 94% of the West Bank.
What do you think about this one?
All right, 1 second. 1 moment. I'm pulling up a good link.
Okay, I'll pull it up.
Yeah, 1 second.
94% of the West Bank. So what happened?
So I'm sending you a link.
No, I know. I'm saying like, what happened? Where is it?
Yeah, right. So
This
there's
is the books, Camp David, The Tragedy of Errors.
So, oh fuck! It's a. Hold on, I'm gonna send you the archive, the unpaywall, the pay.
Let me see if I can. Let me see if I can get through it. Nope, I cannot get through it with.
I got you.
Adblock.
You can with the archive. 1 second. All right, use this one. It's about Robert Malley, it's by Robert Malley, who was recently pushed out of the Biden administration.
Okay, while you explain this, by the way, I gotta go pee again real quick. Sorry.
Yeah. So this article kind of lays out what I think is kind of the definitive perspective from somebody who was, like on the U.S. side, that what really came, what really felt the breakdown in negotiations came from Israel, and that essentially, rather than Israel making an offer at Camp David that the Palestinians could seriously accept, the Israeli side was so unwilling to make the political sacrifices necessary to put an offer forward that the Palestinians could accept, that the talks broke down, or rather the offer came and there was no basis for a path forward. And then the Israeli domestic political situation exploded with the rise of Ariel Sharon, and this, is the provocations to send the Palestinians into the street as the talks broke down pretty definitively, or rather had broken down before. And I think that, for your viewers, the people who are still listening here while Hasan is taking a whiz, that this article, if you want to read it, kind of lays out pretty straightforwardly the, failures at Camp David and to whom they can be attributed. Trying to see where's
there's also this as well.
Oh yeah, there we go.
This Guardian article talking about Israel spurning Palestinian offer of biggest Yerushalayim in history. Leaked papers reveal negotiators propose concessions on East Jerusalem settlements, Sheikh Jarrah, and Old City holy sites quietly. And like the Palestinian Authority leaders privately discussed giving up part of the Flashpoint Arab neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, according to leaked documents, and they proposed a joint committee to take over the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount holy sites in the Old City of Jerusalem, the highly sensitive issue that, along with refugee rights, sank the Camp David talks in 2000 and triggered the Second Palestinian Intifada. So this is what you're referencing, right? I mean, this is part of what you're referencing, I think,
yes.
Right?
I mean, essentially, yes. And we've gotten the article that I just shared was published in August 01. So we've learned many, many things since then. But part of the reason I wanted to I shared this link was because it was so fresh at the time, and meaning that like this, this talking point that like, oh, Israel gave Palestinians the deal of the century was like, as you can imagine, a misrepresentation of how talks had broken down, and that the Israelis and Palestinians just had they wanted fundamentally different things at the table, which, by the way, is sort of is really and I have a pretty good idea of what the next rejections are that the Mr. PragerU goes for, or David Blog goes to explain, because it does just come down to like, if you're going to make an offer that there's no chance of being accepted because it's part of like you're operating on cloud nine, and there's no world of concessions that you would ever make that the Palestinians would accept, and there's no world in which what the Palestinians want is something that you would give. You could just say that, every time you don't come to an agreement, it was a rejection. It comes down to framing, really. Like, it is a kind of weasel word sort of thing. But let's go on and see how he tries to continue spinning this.
Do you also?
Because the other thing, by the way, these land swaps. Also, I will say he offers it on all the 90% historical, whatever. But left unresolved, in addition to Jerusalem, by the way, and this issue was, right of return, of course, and these other issues. There was not enough progress made in resolving what were the other major political sticking points that were not just the land, which was still, by the way, by itself not resolved.
And also, at every single step of this, at every single step of the way, Israel has maintained its occupation, and therefore, in an effort of showing good faith, could have absolutely followed along by force if they wanted to these conditions that were seen as favorable at the time that I guess like the Palestinians simply rejected. So that part is also very silly ultimately. Like there is no saying Palestinians rejected these offers and that's why we just had to continue partitioning the West Bank is idiotic. Like I think it's ridiculous. Oh, all right, my mom made me food.
Oh, nice. Lucky you. I gotta go get dinner soon.
Okay. We'll burn through the remaining 2 minutes hopefully.
Yeah.
But okay.
With East Jerusalem as its capital. But the Palestinian leader rejected the offer. In the words of U.S. President Bill Clinton, Arafat was...
Also, there's no mention of the Oslo Accords. You notice he skipped from 1967 to 2000.
The only reason that these talks are happening is because the Bush the Bush 1 administration forced Israel to Madrid, and then it's like a whole it's obviously collapsing the whole history by which like Israel was strong-armed to be at the table in the first place, and then they take the one pithy thing Bill Clinton said about it to give them a soundbite that they can flagellate to death until there is no more Palestine left.
Yeah. I mean, if you present it like this, it seems real fucked up, man. Seems like these Palestinians didn't know what was good for them when Israel was so kind enough to say, hey, I know we like took all this land from you and displaced you from said land with another occupying force, but why do you keep saying no to these good deals that we keep offering you? It's kind of fucked up. Yeah.
Here 14 days and said no to everything. Instead, the Palestinians launched a bloody wave of suicide bombings that killed over 1,000 Israelis.
Yeah, we went into that
and
earlier.
maimed thousands more on buses, in wedding halls, and in pizza parlors. Rejection number 4. In 2008, Israel tried yet again. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert went even further than Ehud Barak had, expanding the peace offer.
This is the funniest part about this, of course, is that like at this point, settlements are a constant, and it is like West Bank is fully occupied. Now restriction of movement has taken place fully. Like this is like post 1994 in the 2000s. At this point, like. Before Gaza, before Israel completely withdraws from Gaza, forcibly taking settlers, forcibly removing Jewish settlers in Gaza at gunpoint so that they could completely close it off to the rest of the world. They already started restricting movement and partitioning off the West Bank that it occupied illegally. And was doing what B'Tselem called the permit tyranny.
I just sent you a link on the
I clicked on it.
Thing.
Abbas never said no to 2008 peace deal.
And scroll down also to when he did say that, like Abbas said that he rejected it later, like in 2015. It's because like he couldn't look at like so. I don't think that really quite contradicts what Olmer is saying so much as like he's saying that he wouldn't. I mean, for one thing, by the way. Palestinian leaders have a lot of incentives, and as well as Israeli leaders, to reject a lot of the leaked plans that come out or distance themselves from that. Because why would you want to be the guy associated with giving something up when the deal didn't work out? Why would you want to be associated with a concession thing? So I think like a bit of grain of salt on that point. But I think that what this illustrates is that like the 2008 thing ended up breaking down because of geopolitics. Like there was no actual incentive to get a deal done. And Omer was in an extremely rickety position. He was not. I mean, he ended up being prosecuted afterward because of corruption from the time that he was Jerusalem mayor. And Omer ended up, he was like he went to great pains later. Like we learned about how he said Abbas rejected this because he gave an interview to the New Republic in which he emphasized that these talks have potential down the line. And so that's rejection. I guess. I'm curious. Is that number 4 number? I don't understand if like this is number 4 that we're going to, or if there's yet another rejection that we have to learn about.
I don't understand it either.
Include additional land to sweeten the deal. Like his predecessor,
additional land.
the new Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, turned the deal down. Rejection number 5.
That
In
was
between
ridiculous.
these last two Israeli offers, Israel unilaterally left Gaza, giving the Palestinians complete control there.
Okay, that is just a lie. That's a lie. Like, Palestinians do not have complete control.
No, that's the worst one,
yeah.
but that's the one that is off repeated, where it's like,
Yes.
it's a literal fucking concentration camp. They've ghettoized the West Bank, okay,
And,
they have turned.
and the disengagement is also like, it was a so basically in the mid 2000s there were not by the mid 2000s there were really not that many settlements in Gaza. Like, you're talking about fewer than 10,000 people, I believe. Versus the West Bank, which is, I mean, at this point, millions.
Yeah, why didn't they do the same thing in West Bank, you think?
Well, I mean, it's because the reality is because in the West Bank, if you look at like a map and it's like, where do Jews live and where do Arabs live? It's like, like they're all mixed together. And so the nature of occupation is about maintaining maintaining separation between Jews and Palestinians.
But those settlements also deliberately were placed so that the Palestinian land that Palestinians lived in were partitioned off from one another as well. And the roads that were built around it, and then of course the actual walls that were erected specifically were designed in a deliberate way to make sure that there was no contiguity between any of the areas where Arabs lived in the West Bank, which, by the way, for those of you at home, and I cannot stress this enough, is recognized as Palestinian land given to the Palestinians that Israel is currently illegally occupying. This goes beyond the Israel nation state formation. This is just a complete destruction of international laws in our supposed liberal rule-based order.
Absolutely. And in this case, with the disengagement, it's this open air prison and all this other, all these other things, but it enabled, in a sense, what they gave, Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister at the time that they oversaw it. He was no dummy, and he was extremely not a softie. He had been the defense minister who had been in office at the time in '82 of the murder of the massacres of Sabra and Shatila. So he was a hardline. And so, this is like this maneuver, which everybody said, would go down a disaster. It actually went off, it was very clean. The effect of it is that it essentially allowed Israel to, in response to the election of Hamas, to basically say, whatever goes on there is their problem. And whatever they do to us is their fault. And it basically, it became, it was a huge strategic advance. It was a huge strategic advance. And, it benefits from the fact that Judea and Samaria, as the Israelis call them, there are more real and quote unquote real, there are biblical references that you could point to about why you want to be in this hilltop or this mountaintop. But Gaza did not have that kind of historical connection, or not historical, rather biblical connection to Jews. And I think that it was the kind of extreme, almost dorm room level thinking about we'll give the settlers the West Bank, and then we'll let the Arabs run their have their mess in Gaza, and we will continue to as to use the phrase that Netanyahu used in a few years ago in a private meeting. He would just decide how high the flames would get.
Oh yeah, that what you're talking about also I brought up before. But it is from a 2019 closed-door meeting in Likud, where he openly states that any effort to thwart a Palestinian nation-state development must be by using Hamas as the real counterbalance and propping up Hamas as the equal partner, right? All Palestinian nation-state development projects should be pointed back to Hamas, completely neutering the Palestinian Authority, which, at least publicly, they were supposedly collaborating with. Something along those lines. I paraphrased it a little bit. That was, but that was a deliberate attempt to show Hamas as the singular force for Palestinians, the only group that is to be reckoned with when you are talking about Palestinian rights or Palestinian needs, Palestinian interests, and that was done specifically so that you could show the rest of the world that it is justifiable to continue your bombing campaign and ethnic displacement, because look, these guys, the only people that they like are these Islamist fundamentalists who look at them. They can't even hold a nation state together. Of course, they're omitting key details there with it being a fucking concentration camp, but that was by design, which I think has played a role, in my opinion, in getting more and more Palestinians to also start seeing that as the reality that Hamas is the only option remaining.
Yes.
Because while they were doing that deliberately behind closed door meetings, they were also very openly acting like they were collaborating with the Palestinian Authority while simultaneously undermining the Palestinian Authority. So what did the West Bank, what did the Palestinian Authority have to show for the West Bank? You can't get construction permits. Your land has been partitioned into oblivion. You have more and more checkpoints propping up. You have an apartheid system that is glaringly obvious. You have two different license plates to go through certain roads, and you can't go to where the Israeli roads are, even though that's technically supposed to be your land that Israel is occupying. And of course, the only way to justify that existence was through strict military mandate and have the only form of policing be an occupying force that bullies you, humiliates you, and defends violent settlers who spit on you, throw trash at you, and sometimes even kill you and get away with it. Of course, the people of the Palestinian people who remain in historical Palestine are going to look at that situation and go, why the fuck are we even collaborating with the Israeli state when they've given us zero security assurances and all they've done is stolen our land and partitioned it and made us feel unsafe in our own homes, that some dude from Brooklyn can come in and just like take over on a moment's notice, on a whim.
Let's ride this one out so that I can go make some dinner and not lose my appetite. Continually with this one.
Instead of developing this territory for the good of its citizens, the Palestinians turned Gaza into a terrorist base from which they have fired thousands of rockets into Israel. Each time Israel has agreed to a Palestinian state, the Palestinians have rejected the offer, often violently. So if you're interested in peace in the Middle East, maybe the answer is not to pressure Israel to make yet another offer of a state to the Palestinians. Maybe the answer is to pressure the Palestinians to finally accept the existence of a Jewish state. I'm David Bragg, Executive Director of the Maccabee Task Force for Prager University.
Yeah. It's to let Israel do, the same slow ethnic cleansing campaign and mass displacement campaign that they've engaged in.
Yeah, David Blog, you are officially disinvited from the Jewish cookout. Mm-hmm. You are no longer, I do not expect a seat there. You're cooked. You're done.
Fucked up. Noah, thank you so much for coming on.
This is my pleasure. It felt really good to talk about all this and to do it for your lovely viewers. Before I go, I would like to plug my podcast, Blowback, www.blowback.show. Please sign up and subscribe. You can listen to the first episode right now wherever you get your podcasts. And stay tuned for, I guess I'll try to write an article or something as events unfold. But I would just make a last appeal to your listeners. If they're able to donate, I'll give a couple names of groups that I think are worthy in a moment. Just pull them up. All right.
Palestinian Children's Relief Fund.
Yes, I was at Children's Relief Fund, and the also Middle East Children's Alliance, MECA for Peace.org. I think that those are the two links, organizations that I've heard going around that are worth supporting at this time. And and look, I'll say, as a real last note, just to sign off. This issue is the third rail in American public life for a number of reasons, and it's the issue that I think sort of really shows that on the issues where Americans can have the most impact in the world on foreign policy and so on, we are the most aggressively demobilized by our media and the political establishment, and it's kind of incumbent on people as individuals to figure out how can I position myself against that and people in my life against that? And do I have answers on how that happens? I have no fucking idea. But
how can you cut through the noise?
Through everyone's heads.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, it's be educated, be intelligent. And, if you're going to be annoying online, try not to have that reflect an off-putting, mode of engagement with the people in your life. not much more you can ask for, I think. And I guess hashtag force the vote. I don't know. I'm kidding.
Oh, no.
Those people have gone nuts, obviously.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Noah.
My pleasure. I'll see you. We'll talk soon.
All right, bye. All right, everybody, that was Noah Kulwin. We are going to move on with the coverage. I hope that was instructive, informative. I hope that gave you at least some of the tools that you need to combat misinformation around some of the more common talking points that people who defend Israel come to you with in an effort to try and hide the shame and the abject violence that Palestinians are subjected to on a daily basis in the formation of the Israeli nation state and the continuation of the Israeli expansion that is, of course, illegal,